Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. I am delighted to say that today we have we've been joined by a very distinguished figure in Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, Professor Rashid Khalidi, to discuss what the new administration holds for Palestine, US administration, and also to review the Trump era. Professor Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. His work on the Middle East and Palestine are too many for me to cite here, but I will mention his last publication, which is the 100 Years War on Palestine, which won the prize for the Best Academic Award in the 2020 Palestine Book Awards. Welcome, Professor Khalidi.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be with you.
If I can begin with a question that continues the theme of your last book, which divides Palestinian struggle for statehood into 6 stages, beginning with the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the 1948 Nakba, the War of '67, and then goes through to the period marking the Second Intifada 2 decades ago. You describe the moments as declarations of war. If you were to write this book now, would you have added a 7th chapter and considered the many setbacks under the Trump era as another declaration of war? I guess what I'm asking is, within the premise of your book, what constitutes a declaration of war?
That's a good question. I might well do that, yes. I finished writing the book before the end of the Trump administration, before the revelation of his so-called peace plan, which I think I would have probably considered a declaration of war. In fact, the last chapter does include a treatment of what the Trump administration had done up to the point that I sent the book to press, which includes much of what was later on included in the so-called peace plan. And I think I would have called it a declaration of war simply because, like earlier international declarations sponsored by great powers, whether Great Britain or the United States or the Soviet Union or others, what the so-called Trump peace plan envisaged was a series of measures that were entirely designed to further the Israeli colonial project and to prevent Palestinian self-determination, which I think was the argument that I was making insofar as the Balfour Declaration of 1917, or the Partition Plan of 1947, or the UN Security Council Resolution of 1967, Security Council Resolution 242. Each of these and other actions that I cite as declarations of war were intended to further Israeli objectives in terms of seizing Palestine and to prevent the Palestinians from achieving their rights. And so certainly the Trump plan fits into that pattern. And it might well have been, I think if I rewrote the book today or were to rewrite it, I would certainly include it as a 7th declaration of war.
I mean, it was quite different from your previous publications in the sense that it was very, I thought it was very personal, and you cite your, I think, great uncle, or maybe there's another great there, I'm not sure, who was the mayor of Jerusalem, I think, at the time,
right.
And his prophetic observations of what the Zionist project could mean for the Palestinians, who at the time were 95% of the population. I mean, do you want to shed some light on that? I mean, how your great uncle, who managed to foresee what many could not foresee?
Yeah, I actually start the book with his letter to Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, in which, exactly as you say, this man who had been the deputy for Jerusalem in the first Ottoman parliament, who had served several times as mayor of Jerusalem, told Herzl that while he had enormous sympathy because of the persecution of Jews in Europe, which he was very well aware of, he had worked in Vienna, he had taught and studied in Vienna, and he was intimately acquainted with the virulence of European anti-Semitism, and specifically the anti-Semitism that Herzl, as an Austrian journalist, had been victim of. He said he begged Herzl not to go forward with his project because, as he said, Palestine already has a people that is not willing to be supplanted. So yes, I cite that not because he was my great uncle, but as you say, because he was very farsighted in understanding perfectly well what Herzl intended, in spite of the honeyed words in his public statements. And I cite private statements of Herzl's in his diaries, as well as what I would argue was the disingenuous response that Herzl sent to Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi, the former mayor, former deputy of Jerusalem, which I also talk about in the book. And I think the importance of this is it establishes a pattern whereby this colonial project is clothed in a disingenuous and false light in its public presentation, but it always was intended at supplanting the original population, which is a project which is obviously still ongoing on the part of the Israeli state, essentially supported throughout by international actors. What Herzl was trying to do was only as effective as it was because of his successor achieving the support of the British government via the Balfour Declaration, and that's been the pattern to the present day.
We will be getting to foreign patrons, I think, later on in the conversation. Sticking to history, I mean, you're a historian. One of the goals of history is to make sense of the present by looking at the past. Many would look at the current position in the Middle East, the situation there, and come away with a very bleak and pessimistic conclusion with regards to the question of Palestine. But how should the current stage be viewed within the wider frame of history? Palestinians have encountered far worse crises, and if anything can be said with certainty is that their struggle is extremely resilient. So looking back at the past, how should we navigate this current situation?
Well, I try and balance that pessimistic assessment, which I think you're right, is present in the book, with, as you say, or as you imply in your question, the fact that the Palestinians have been extraordinarily resilient. The subtitle of the book is A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017. And I think it's very, very important to understand that and to compare this specific settler colonial project, which is quite different from every other, but which, like every other, has engendered intense resistance, with other settler colonial projects, many of which have been much more successful. I live in the most successful of them, the United States of America. Canada, New Zealand, Australia are successful colonial settler projects where the resistance of the indigenous population was overwhelmed. They still exist, they are still resisting in the United States or in Canada, First Nations in Canada, Aboriginal peoples in Australia and so forth, Maoris in New Zealand. The Palestinians have been even more successful than they were over 100 years. Now, we're not at the end of this process. Anything could happen. But I think that there is reason for hope in that, as well as in the fact, I know we're going to come back to this, as well as the fact that this project is dependent on external support. And that external support is not necessarily eternal, and that external support is not necessarily unshakable. And that's something that successful resistance movements to colonial settler projects have understood in Algeria, in South Africa, in East Africa. Successful resistance movements on the part of the indigenous population have understood the importance of external support. I don't think the Palestinians have fully incorporated that into their resistance. This is not a project of Zionism and Israelis alone. It is a larger project. Without understanding that, you cannot successfully resist it. Zionism always understood, the Zionist leaders and Israeli leaders today understand intimately how important the success of what they're doing, how importantly it relates to external support. And they're extraordinarily sensitive to any fluctuation in that external support. The gushing pipeline of money to Israel is dependent on a level of external support, which is extraordinary, and without which that project just doesn't have the successes that it has. Yeah. And Palestinians have to understand that, and understand that you can resist on that level as well.
Yeah, I mean, we will, as you said, get onto that discussion and look at the wider cracks that's happening. But if we can turn our attention to the Trump era, there's a tendency to view Trump's 4 years in office as an aberration of US history. Is that really the case? You have a book titled Brokers of Deceit, which looks at how the US has undermined peace in the Middle East. Knowing what you know now, or knowing what you've known for many years about US history, do you see Trump as an aberration or a continuation?
That is a good question. And I would have to say both. Trump is a continuation in that the Zionist project since Woodrow Wilson has always enjoyed the support of American administrations, of the American political class, and of the bulk of American public opinion. That was true even before the United States came to play a predominant role starting in the 1940s, and has continued ever since. And in that sense, the Trump administration simply represents a continuation of unlimited support for this project and later for the state of Israel, which in fact has grown over time. It was not anywhere near as great in the 40s and the 50s as it came to be from the 60s onwards. And so Trump represents a continuation. He represents an aberration in that the Trump administration abandoned all restraints on American support for Israel, which became not just unlimited, but became tied to the maximal aspirations of the most extreme government in Israeli history. The United States no longer, in effect, I would argue, had a policy which in some respects deviated from the policies of the government of Israel, even if only verbally. It had a policy which marched in lockstep with the most extreme rhetoric of the most extreme government in Israeli history. And in fact, in my view, was essentially determined by that government. I'm not saying that Netanyahu dictated. I'm saying that people like Kushner and the ambassador, David Friedman, whom Trump appointed to Israel, had exactly the same mindset as the settler colonial group that dominates this Israeli government. People who see the Greater Land of Israel project, which involves taking over the entirety of Palestine and denying any self-determination to the Palestinians, as their soulmates. So people like Kushner and Friedman are in fact major contributors to the settlement project in the occupied territories, in the occupied West Bank. And that represents, in my view, an aberration.
Aberration, yeah. Tell us a bit about the memorandum of understanding between US administration's previous ones with the Israelis, which basically blocks any chance of sovereign Palestinian state emerging. When was that agreed, and what are the details, quickly, if you can?
That was agreed in the mid-70s by Henry Kissinger as part of an American attempt to put pressure, ironically, on Israel to make concessions over the Second Sinai Disengagement Agreement and over other things in the Middle East, which the United States was forcing them to make. One of the arguments I make in this book, and I made before, is that the United States Middle East policy is not hostage to Israel where vital American interests are concerned. So where getting the Soviets out of the Middle East or preventing a major conflagration in the Middle East are concerned, or a conflagration with Iran, the United States will step all over Israel and force it to do what American vital interests dictate. And as part of that, what Kissinger was doing was offering the Israelis a stop. What he said is that anything we put forward on the Palestine issue, which is not seen in Washington as a vital American interest, will be effectively subject to an Israeli veto. The memo of understanding doesn't say exactly that, but that is what it has taken. That is what it has been taken to mean in practice. So the United States doesn't put forward anything without the Israelis vetting it, and the Israelis shape those so-called American proposals. Whence the statement by one of the major American negotiators that America is not a broker or a mediator. America is Israel's lawyer. It serves Israel's interests in Israeli-Palestinian affairs. That's not true where larger strategic interests are concerned. If the United States wants to sell weapons to some Middle East autocracy, it goes ahead and does that. It modifies that. to fit some Israeli desiderata, but it will go ahead and do that. It did that with the AWACS. It's done that with multiple weapons sales. And so the point here is that this memorandum of understanding means that the United States is hostage, in effect, to an Israeli veto over anything that has to do with the issue of Palestine.
So let's move on to the Biden administration. Trump's gone and the new president has come in. What are your initial thoughts about the Biden administration? But before you do, let me share a quote by a Democrat congressman. Recently on, I think MSNBC said that there will be a radical reset. He said Biden is going to make clear, and I quote, that Israel is an ally and always has been an ally, but Israel has to recognize that Palestinian statehood matters. They can't be having new settlements. They can't be burning Palestinian villages. Human rights are going to matter. We are going to have human rights focused foreign policy. Do you believe we will see a radical reset under a Biden presidency?
No, not as far as Palestine is concerned. We may see one regarding Saudi Arabia or Iran. We may see one insofar as human rights are used as a club to beat governments that are recalcitrant, maybe the Egyptian government, Turkey, possibly. There may be a reset in some aspects of Middle East policy, but I would argue not in regard to Palestine. There will indeed be a change in rhetoric. There will no longer be this almost slavish imitation, I would say imitation, almost slavish following of the most extreme doctrines spouted by Israeli politicians by the United States, where the United States basically says, you want to annex? Yes, you can annex. You want Jerusalem? You can have Jerusalem. You want the Golan Heights? Yes. Settlements are not illegal, and so on and so forth. That rhetorical aberration will be corrected. There will be a number of other cosmetic shifts. The United States will reopen a consulate in East Jerusalem. The United States may allow the PLO to reopen its office in Washington. The United States may resume funding of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The United States may give some AID money to the Palestinian Authority. None of this has any impact in real terms on the basis.
Reverse to the status quo, which isn't
exactly,
really.
The status quo
really.
The other change will be a rhetorical change, going back to meaningless, empty condemnations of Israeli actions, which are clearly violent assaults on the status quo, the expansion of settlements, the demolition of homes, the detention of children. So there will be the usual meaningless slaps on the wrist, followed by funding by the United States of whatever Israel does, followed by defense at the Security Council and everywhere else of Israel against any possible sanction, followed by rhetoric against the nonviolent movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, by leading administration officials. The new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations criticized BDS the other day before the Security Council. So you will have a change in meaningless rhetoric. We will go back to the woe is me, you shouldn't establish settlements, but here's another $1 billion to do suppress the Palestinians, or another several $1 billion to suppress the Palestinians. I don't consider that a radical reset. I think human rights will continue to be an opportunistic tool to leverage things in the Middle East to the advantage of the United States, whether vis-a-vis Israel or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Turkey. But I don't see that as, and that may produce minor changes in behavior on the part of Middle Eastern actors, including Israel. But I don't see that as a radical reset. A radical reset would be saying Palestinian rights have to be treated with the same respect as Israeli rights. So if Israelis have a right to immigration, so do Palestinians. If Israelis have a right to security, so do Palestinians. If Israelis have a right to self-determination, so do Palestinians. And our policy, which is to say not just our verbal policy, but the money that we put into this will, and our actions in the Security Council and elsewhere, will go towards furthering those aims. So when Israel does things that make Palestinian self-determination impossible, like chopping the West Bank up into hundreds of little Bantustans, the United States will say, we're going to subtract $900 million or $1.5 billion from the money we give you annually, the $3.8 billion in military aid we give you annually, to prevent you from doing this, or to express our disapproval of your doing. That would be a radical reset, and that is not going to happen.
I think the next question I have, kind of goes to the crux of the whole issue. I wonder how many people are aware of the limitations of US presidents when it comes to Palestine. President Obama very candidly wrote about this in his autobiography, A Promised Land, which I reviewed. He said, I'm going to quote him in length, 3 quotes, but they're really, really insightful quotes. He said, members of both parties worried about crossing the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, known as APEC. He went on to say that APEC's cloud could be brought to bear on virtually every congressional district in the country. And just about every politician in Washington, including me, he said, counted APEC among their key supporters and donors. And this particular one, I guess, goes to the crux of it all. Dealing with Israel, he said, is unlike dealing with any other country. Normal policy differences with an Israeli prime minister exacted a domestic political cost that simply didn't exist when it dealt with the UK, Germany, France, Japan, Canada, or any other closest allies of the US. So President Barack Obama personally. He mentions his relationship with you in his autobiography while speaking of how heavily the Palestinian issue weighed on his shoulders. Knowing what you know about the former president, how do you see his failure to restrain Israel? Is blaming APEC an easy excuse, or do you see deep structural arrangements within US politics that impede genuine progress and obstruct US presidents?
That's a very good and long question, which requires
I wanted to provide a background. Background.
No,
you know him personally.
It requires a detailed answer. I'll try and be brief. Very, very bluntly, I do see that the President Obama's failure in dealing with Israel related to an unwillingness to exert, to use the political muscle that an American president has. He did use that muscle in pushing through the Iran nuclear deal. So where a vital interest was perceived to be at stake, he was perfectly willing to brook the ferocious opposition of Netanyahu and the Republican Party, who together conspired in a way that is almost, in terms of the Republicans, treasonous, to try and undermine the foreign policy of an elected US president. They did so by bringing Netanyahu twice to speak before joint sessions of Congress to attack the foreign policy of the president. It's inconceivable in any other circumstance. So Obama was right in saying that in dealing with Israel, one faces the kind of issues that are inconceivable with even the closest other American ally. But he brooked that. He was perfectly willing on an issue that he and his advisors saw was absolutely vital to the United States. It meant not going to war with Iran. They saw this agreement as the only alternative to going to war with Iran, and they were under no circumstances willing to do that. And the American public supported that. The American public has been against Middle Eastern wars since about 2004. Just after George W. Bush was reelected, public opinion shifted against those wars, and it has been consistently against Middle Eastern wars ever since. Obama ran on a platform which included opposition to Middle Eastern wars. So, by the way, did President Trump. Neither ended those wars, incidentally. So, in so doing, he was supported by public opinion, even though AIPAC and the Republicans, a formidable coalition, certainly, fought tooth and nail against the Iran nuclear agreement. He was not willing to do that on the Palestine issue. He appointed Senator Mitchell, George Mitchell, as his mediator. At the outset of his administration, it was one of his first appointments. And when Mitchell tried, as I recount in this book, to push a plan which would have involved the United States opening to Hamas, basically he was shut down. I go into the details. And the president was not willing to fight that fight, or a number of other fights. Later on, Secretary Kerry, his Secretary of State, came up with a plan. And again, the president was not willing to fight that fight or to do any more than allow the United States to abstain on a resolution that was passed in the last few weeks of his presidency. Yeah. So I do fault him for doing that. Now, the other part of your question is, are there deep structural arrangements within US policy? politics that impede a president from going forward. Yes, there are, but as was not the case when he was president, there are now beginning to be countervailing forces in US politics. There is a bloc of members of the House of Representatives, which now is probably in the realm of 36 or maybe more House members, and about a half dozen, 5, 6, 7 US senators, who are willing to brave the vituperative, ferocious opposition of AIPAC and of other friends of Israel, and of the leadership of their own party, which is completely committed to an Israeli version of events. The Democratic Party leadership is pro-Israel to an extraordinary extent. We're talking about Pelosi, Schumer, the Clintons, and so forth. These folks, and many, many others seated throughout the government, are as zealous supporters of Israel as the Republicans are. They're not as extreme in their rhetoric, but they are. And these folks in Congress that I'm talking about, who represent a very large proportion, if not the majority, of the Democratic grassroots, in fact, are not afraid of AIPAC. Every single one of the 24 people who co-sponsored a resolution by Congresswoman Betty McCollum of Minnesota to prevent Israeli detention of minors, every single one of them was reelected in November 2020. Another dozen or so, people like Cori Bush, people like Jamal Bowman, people like Mondaire Jones, people like Marie Newman in Illinois, were elected on a platform which explicitly supported Palestinian rights, and in the teeth of ferocious opposition from AIPAC. Jones and Bowman were elected in districts that had formerly been held by Nita Lowey and Eliot Engel, two of the most extreme partisans of Israel in the Democratic Party. Engel was defeated, Lowey had retired, and her chosen successor was defeated. So this is new. This didn't exist during Obama's presidency. That doesn't mean that things have changed in the Democratic Party. They are maybe going to begin to change. But that was something that was not present. There has never been a bloc of elected representatives who take positions even as moderately critical of Israel and as moderately pro-Palestinians as these.
So I think this kind of neatly goes into our final question, which is to do with the breakup of support for Israel and where that's coming from. You write eloquently about how throughout history, the success of Zionism rested on 3 pillars: the weakness and divisions amongst Arabs is one, recruitment of foreign patrons such as the US, and before that the UK, and before that, of course, the Ottoman Empire. There was a desire to have the Ottoman Empire be a patron. And the third of those pillars is the support of the Jewish community in the diaspora. Do you see any of the 3 pillars weakening? Just to give an example, some have observed that with the moral case of Israel seeping away, not least because of probes such as the International Criminal Court, Batsalam's position paper, which concluded that Israel is an apartheid state. So these surely is having an effect on Jewish communities in the diaspora, who are by and large progressive liberals. So do we see a breakup of the third pillar in any significant way, or are we overestimating the liberal force within the Jewish diaspora?
I think in the United States, the things you've talked about are operative, certainly with the younger generation of people in the Jewish community, people in college and university, people who are not of the generation that either experienced or remembered their parents' experiences of the Holocaust, or who were adults in 1967, when supporters of Israel were convinced that Israel faced extermination, another Holocaust, which in fact wasn't the case, but they certainly sincerely believed that. People much younger than that, people in their teens and 20s and 30s, in the Jewish community and elsewhere, I think, who are progressive, have a completely different set of understandings of the situation as between Palestine and Israel. They don't see Israel as a tiny, beleaguered, endangered state. They don't see Israel as the victim. They see the Palestinians as weak and Israel as enormously strong. They see the Palestinians as victims. victims. And that means that, yes, certainly in the United States, I don't think this is true of every part of the diaspora. I think the British Jewish community, I think the French Jewish community, in many respects, are much more conservative. Young people in those communities may be progressive, but the communities as a whole, certainly France, are much more conservative and much more pro-Israeli than is the case in the United States, where you have a very powerful constituency that supports Israel among Orthodox Jews, among older and richer Jews, the more established segments of the community, the better off segments of the community, whereas the younger people, ordinary middle class people, have a different view in this country. I'm not sure to what extent that's true in other European countries. It certainly is in this country. On the other hand, I think it has to be said that Israel has managed to engender support among evangelicals and conservative Republicans in a way that gives them an alternative power base in the United States. The Democratic Party is split on this issue. The leadership and more conservative, older members of the party have the traditional pro-Israel view. Younger, more progressive members of the party, and the bulk, I think, there are polls that show a large portion, if not the majority, of the Democratic base are much more critical of Israel than the leadership is. The Republican Party is in lockstep with Israel. And this has very little to do with the American Jewish community. This is an evangelical and Southern conservative set of views. But I do think that these pillars are not as firm, all of them, whether the support within the American Jewish community, which was the essential base of support for Israel from the beginning. David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the first prime minister and the second president of Israel, spent years in the United States during and after World War I, helping to build up this base within the American Jewish community and within American political elite and public opinion of support for Israel. And that has always been one of the core supporting elements for Zionism and later for the state of Israel. And I think that that is beginning to change. As are other things. I mean, I think that
if I could just add a comment made by one of the Israeli ambassadors to the US, in a conversation with one of the pro-Israeli think tanks, he said the only real geostrategic threat facing Israel is that Israel will no longer be seen as a moral cause. It will become a state where might defines right. So basically a state which has gone so far right and it doesn't have the moral clout. That he admitted was the only significant strategic threat to Israel. I think we're heading that way in the sense that Israel
I agree. But remember, there are a lot of people in the American political life for whom might does make right. The Republican Party largely adheres to that view. Their view of human rights and morality in politics is a very dim one. It is in the Democratic Party, the majority party in the United States, of course, that views issues of morality and might not necessarily making right have some traction. Let me say one last thing, which is Israel is vulnerable in terms of the first of the things you talked about, which is the issue of weakness and division among the Arabs. It's not just a matter of weakness and division. It's unrepresentative and undemocratic governments, which are pliable and susceptible to external pressure, which have always been a pillar of support for Israel. Stronger governments that had a great deal of autonomy internationally, have always been a problem for Israel. One of the things that Israel and the United States have succeeded in doing, intentionally or unintentionally, is to break up some of the stronger states in the Middle East, or at least they have broken up in part because of American policy, at least. Iraq, Libya, Syria are basically nation states with no international clout because they're completely divided. They're subject to deep internal divisions. They have massive problems. On top of this is the absence of democracy in most countries in the Arab world. Most people in the Arab world support the Palestine issue. Those views are not represented by unrepresentative anti-democratic governments. So a government that knows that public opinion opposes normalization of Israel will go ahead with it because it knows that the riot police and the secret police and the torturers in their prison can keep down opposition because they don't care about public opinion. They can suppress it in these anti-democratic Arab regimes. To the extent to which that status quo, anti-democratic status quo, is challenged, Israel is challenged. Israel depends on having a weak, divided Arab world in which unrepresented, illegitimate governments are supported from the outside and therefore are susceptible to pressure, like the Sudanese, the Moroccan, Emirati, and Bahraini governments, which have agreed to normalize relations with Israel. That did not represent the sentiment of the Moroccan or the Sudanese people. It probably didn't represent the sentiments of most people in the Gulf. And those governments go ahead with those things. So when and if that changes, and there have been challenges to that status quo in 2011, 2012, there were challenges again in 2019 in Algeria and Sudan, in a number of Lebanon and Iraq. And I'm sure there will be challenges in the future. Will they be successful or not? That's another issue. Yes. But that is a pillar. Arab weakness is a pillar of Israel's strength. And that is partly based on the undemocratic nature, the weak, illegitimate nature of these regimes. They are weak because they do not have the support of their peoples.
That's right. The shifting sands of Middle Eastern geopolitics, I don't think we can take anything for certainty. So this change will come. I have so many more questions to ask you, but we have come to the end of our time. I want to thank Professor Khalidi for joining us. I highly recommend his book, winner of the 2020 Palestine Book Awards, The 100 Years War on Palestine. I hope to see you again soon. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.